You are looking live at a pine tree in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, where the president is gathering night at that tree, but a little bit further back at his club. Who knows? Arnie, have details of that second meeting that's being planned for the fall with Vladimir Putin. And if the guy who runs the House Homeland Security Committee has his way, Michael McCaul says proceed carefully. Take a look.
We need to call out Russia for what they did, and it can't happen again in the midterm elections coming up in 2018. So I'm always for world leaders talking. I think that's a real positive step. I would hope that he would bring up the midterm elections with them, in addition to Crimea, in addition to resolving the crisis in Syria.
Well, there was criticism that he didn't. You had said shortly after that, and I'm quoting you, I hope correctly here, sir, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, this is completely unacceptable. I don't understand the reluctance when he almost sided with Putin over our intelligence community assessment. That, I think, is demoralizing to our intelligence community. It's not the first time he's reacted like this, but he did again. Now, of course, he dialed it back and said that he was sort of didn't get his wording right. Did that satisfy you?
Well, I think he did dial it back. I think he corrected the statement. But again, Neil, I had the classified briefing in October 2016. It's clear and convincing evidence that this came out of the Kremlin, from their intelligence bureau.
So why
and their
does this
FSB,
keep happening? Why does it keep happening? I can understand there's some reluctance on the part of the president, because every time he thinks he raises it, he's feeding this narrative that he's an illegitimately elected president, which he's not. I think even those who understand, yourself included, that the Russians were involved in the last election, they didn't tip the outcome of that election, but it sticks in his craw.
My advice from the beginning with the president and with the previous one was to call out Russia for what they were doing, condemn it, and that there need to be consequences to it. Congress passed sanctions against Russia based upon their interference in our elections, and that was the right thing to do. So I think, the action has been tough. I just think the rhetoric sometimes should be backed up by the tough action we've taken against Russia.
The president says there is nothing wrong with talking to the Russians. There is nothing wrong with having a good relationship with the Russians. He then added in a CNBC interview, Chairman, that when it comes to talking to Vladimir Putin, it's a plus. But if things don't work out, I'll be the worst enemy he has ever had. What did you make of that?
Well, I actually, knowing the president the way I do, I think he means that. I think he's given Putin a chance to form a relationship, but if Putin doesn't do it, I think he'll obviously make an enemy out of him. I personally...
But what is not doing it, sir, just to be clear? I know you back taking punitive measures and actions, I would assume sanctions, additional sanctions, if the Russians dare do something like this again in the next election. But the president has not indicated support for such overwhelmingly popular initiative on the part of Republicans, yourself included.
Well, I think we all supported these sanctions. Look, Russia is violating the sanctions against North Korea. As I speak, I'll be talking about that tomorrow at the Aspen Security Forum here. And I think the president, and I know his advisors are, clear-eyed about who he's dealing with. Mr. Putin was a former KGB officer. Mr. Putin has been very aggressive. We haven't seen a dictator like this out of Russia since probably Stalin. He's been very aggressive in the Baltic states, Crimea and Ukraine.
So if he got aggressive again on just this, if you don't mind, sir, you would recommend additional sanctions. I know there's nothing you can do about 2016, it seems, but if he were to dabble again in our elections in this year, in 2020, additional sanctions would be implemented?
I think the president should get an assurance from the president of Russia, Mr. Putin, that he's not going to interfere in our midterm elections. That is an affront to our democracy.
What if he does? You're calling for additional sanctions. The president has been quiet on this particular issue.
Well, I'm talking about Russia's violation of the sanctions against North Korea,
no,
which
I'm
they
talking
agreed
about
to.
On this, sir, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. On just meddling in our election, if they were to do that again, I guess there's no punishment for what they did in 2016, which seems fairly indisputed. But If they do it again, this measure that came up in the Senate was to punish them for it, additional sanctions. It didn't appear to have much teeth, but do you support such a measure, and do you think the president should as well? Because he hasn't said anything about it.
Well, I do, and I think the sanctions that Congress passed punishes Russia for 2016. If they do it again, Neil, there needs to be consequences to this bad behavior. Otherwise, they're going to continue to do this in our election cycles and assault our democracy.
Okay, let's get a sense of where you think things stand now. Secretary of State Pompeo was indicating that it's always better to talk, but that not everyone in the administration seemed to know what the president was saying. His intelligence director, for example, had no idea that there was even a planned follow-up meeting at the time that the president was considering for the fall. Do you think he should be communicating more with folks like you, even within his own staff?
Well, you know, I'm here at the summit where D&I Director Dan Coates was interviewed and was essentially caught off guard, not knowing that Mr. Putin had been invited to attend the White House for another summit. And I think I always think communication is important, particularly with the guy, your top intelligence official, should be in the loop on this, in addition to the cabinet. Having said that, I always think it's good for world leaders to get together and talk about issues to see if we can come together.
You mentioned North Korea, and of course there'd been some frustration that the North Koreans appear to be dragging their feet on agreeing to denuclearize or even do some of the basic things they had agreed to, like families that could visit along the border and see relatives, returning the remains of U.S. Servicemen and women from that war more than, almost 3/4 of a century ago. What do you make of what they're not doing?
Well, they're not dismantling their nuclear program. Now, they have halted the testing of their nuclear missiles. That's positive. They have returned 3 American prisoners. That's very positive. And they are looking in the near future to return the remains of the prisoner of war in that conflict, which I think that's all positive, Neil. But I think they view what denuclearization means something very different to the North Koreans than it does the United States of America. And while I think we've made progress, we also have to be clear-eyed about what they've done in the past under 3 prior administrations where we've made concessions to them, and then they've just rolled us at the negotiation table. I know this administration is very hawkish. And I think it's important to sit down with Kim Jong-un to work something out. But we also have to continue to apply the maximum campaign pressure on North Korea so that Kim Jong-un's preservation is at stake.
You know, switching gears to trade, if you don't mind, Chairman, we're learning now that the president is willing and open to putting tariffs on every single good from China that comes into this country. That would represent over $500 billion worth. So they're upping the ante. The Chinese promised to return, the salvo here. This is getting pretty scary. What do you think?
It is. I would argue we ought to be focused on technology transfer, the theft of intellectual property and technology that China is so good at with their espionage. I do think this may put more pressure on China and leverage them in the North Korean discussions. But I've been very clear as well, as along with Chairman Brady of Ways and Means, that, if we're going to do trade and tariff wars, we ought to be focused on our enemies and not our friends and allies like our European NATO allies and Canada and Mexico.
So when you hear the president talk about responding in kind, putting tariffs on automobiles, automobile parts, trucks, et cetera, and no one appears to be budging yet, do you think he should prepare the American people? Many of them are unaware that that's something they directly pay. Many think, for example, Congressman, that it's the government that pays that. That he should prepare them for the distinct possibility that they could pay a lot more for a car. They could pay a lot more for a host of items, from TVs to washers and dryers, and you know far better than I. What do you think he should do?
Well, I think, the tax cuts have been very successful. They primed this economy. One of the best economies we've seen probably in my lifetime and yours. I don't want this trade tariff war to undermine that in any way. Now, having said that, China, the trade deficit is enormous. And if the president can negotiate with China in a tough way, the way he can negotiate, and bring down that trade deficit with China, I think that could be a real positive.
Okay, let's talk about ICE. There was an interesting vote on the floor of the House where, better than 130, I think it was 130 Democrats voted present rather than no on this measure that was meant to just show a resolution backing ICE. A lot of your colleagues were upset with that, saying that the Democrats who had been arguing in favor of shutting down ICE, getting rid of it, didn't do that. How about you?
The irony, Neil's that a year ago today, nearly every Democrat voted for my bill to fully authorize ICE into law for the first time ever, including Nancy Pelosi, including the Democrat who introduced the bill to abolish ICE. They brought this fight on when they wanted to abolish ICE. So we wanted to call their bluff and say, okay, great. Then why don't you vote for your bill? Then they backed off and said, we're going to vote against our bill to abolish ICE. And that's precisely the time we put a bill in favor of supporting our men and women in ICE who protect Americans every day from drug traffickers, human traffickers,
Why do you think they did that? Is there a battle, you think, within the party there where they don't want to go too far, but many who are rabid on the left want to just annihilate it?
I think they made a gross miscalculation. Political miscalculation. This is about a 70% winning issue with the American people. I know there's a lot of division within their own ranks. In fact, I heard the Hispanic caucus wasn't even consulted about this bill to abolish ICE. So I think they've got a lot of deep divisions going on. But I think we as Republicans have to drive the law enforcement message. We created ICE after 9/11 for one reason, and that's to keep bad people and bad things out of this country, including terrorists who we stop on average 10 known or suspected terrorists every day in this country. I was a federal prosecutor after 9/11. We used immigration laws to deport potential terrorists. It would be a grave miscalculation to abolish ICE.
I know you got to go, Congressman, so I very much appreciate your time. There are a lot of your colleagues here who are getting a little bit worried at what appeared to be the wind at their back on tax cuts, the improving economy, the markets, backfired a little bit with the president's performance in Helsinki, Finland with Vladimir Putin. And then revelations, of course, as you probably heard late on Friday, that McCaul recorded phone calls he had with the president regarding payments to this former Playboy model, Karen McDougal, that all of a sudden now there were fears that Mr. Cohen might be more than willing to testify against the president. I only mention it that these distractions, are you worried that the advantages Republicans had might be frittering away here?
It concerns me. I think, look, we have I think we're looking strong going into these midterm elections, but some of these issues are out of our control. We passed a tax cut bill that's primed the economy. We have provided $700 billion in defense spending to rebuild our military, which in terms of readiness, the previous administration ran it into the ground. We've done a lot of really positive things for the American people, and I don't want to get off message on that.
All right, he's upset, obviously, about this whole ICE derangement syndrome. The former guy ran ICE after this.